Carl Jung made a discovery in his clinical practice that disturbed him so deeply he initially hesitated to publish his findings, fearing the implications would unsettle both his patients and the wider psychiatric community. He had encountered a specific type of individual whose psychological suffering didn't fit any existing diagnostic category. Yet their distress was undeniable and devastating. These weren't people experiencing hallucinations or delusions. They were individuals whose perception of human nature had developed to such extraordinary levels that it had become socially unbearable. They could read concealed emotions in micro-expressions that others missed entirely, sense the invisible psychological atmospheres structuring every social space, and detect the unconscious agreements holding groups together through collective denial. Jung expected this heightened awareness to grant them advantage in navigating human relationships, but he observed precisely the opposite pattern emerging across multiple cases. These hyperperceptive individuals reported chronic exhaustion from social interaction, profound isolation despite being surrounded by people, and a disturbing pattern of being blamed for problems they were merely observing rather than creating. Jung realized he was witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and social cohesion. Human communities don't actually function through honesty and direct communication, as we commonly believe. They survive through carefully maintained collective denial, where invisible agreements determine which truths can be acknowledged and which must remain hidden for the group to maintain coherence. Every family develops unspoken rules about acceptable conversation topics. Every workplace establishes subtle boundaries around what observations can be voiced without consequence. And every friendship operates within implicit limits on how much psychological truth the relationship can tolerate before fracturing. Individuals with hyperdeveloped perception violate these unconscious social contracts simply by existing authentically, their awareness functioning as an unwanted mirror, reflecting back the shadow contents that communities actively work to suppress. Jung documented that these clear-seeing individuals faced a brutal choice between two equally destructive outcomes: complete withdrawal from social engagement leading gradually toward identity dissolution, or learning what he termed conscious individuation that could transform overwhelming perception into integrated capacity, serving both individual development and collective psychological evolution. This video reveals why heightened perception isolates rather than empowers, the unconscious mechanisms that systematically target hyperperceptive individuals for social rejection, and Jung's specific integration practices for transforming dangerous clarity into conscious strength that protects your psychological boundaries while remaining engaged with human community. You've felt it your entire life. This weight of seeing what everyone around you refuses to acknowledge. You walk into rooms and immediately sense who's performing happiness to mask despair, who's radiating suppressed rage beneath polite smiles, who's drowning in anxiety they'll never admit aloud. While others engage in comfortable surface conversations, you're processing an entirely different layer of reality, the unspoken tensions crackling through every interaction, the invisible power struggles organizing social hierarchies, the collective pretending that structures every group dynamic. And this clarity doesn't empower you. It isolates you in ways that feel impossible to explain to people who only perceive the surface layer of human behavior. You're exhausted after brief social encounters, not because you lack social skills, but because you're simultaneously navigating the reality everyone else inhabits, and the deeper psychological reality they either can't perceive or actively choose to ignore. The worst part isn't just the loneliness. It's the consistent experience of being blamed for problems you're merely observing, accused of manufacturing negativity when you mention obvious difficulties, labeled as the dramatic one when you acknowledge tensions that everyone can feel but collectively agrees to deny. Jung discovered why this happens through decades of clinical work with patients experiencing this exact phenomenon. He recognized these weren't mentally ill individuals suffering from paranoid delusions or social anxiety disorders. They were people whose perceptual systems had developed beyond what their social environments could accommodate. Their suffering originated not from distorted perception, but from accurate perception that exceeded collective tolerance thresholds for psychological truth. What fascinated Jung was how consistently these patients described identical experiences, despite having no contact with one another and coming from vastly different cultural contexts. They all reported that social interaction felt fundamentally different for them compared to how others seemed to experience human connection. One patient explained to Jung that conversations felt like watching films where the audio track and visual elements told completely contradictory stories, creating constant cognitive dissonance that nobody else appeared to notice. Another described entering social gatherings as walking into invisible weather systems of emotion and tension, atmospheric pressures of collective anxiety and suppressed conflict swirling through every interaction, yet remaining completely unacknowledged by the people generating these psychological climates. Jung realized these descriptions weren't poetic metaphors, but accurate accounts of genuinely different perceptual architecture, consciousness registering dimensions of psychological reality that standard human awareness filters out as irrelevant noise. The mechanism behind this heightened perception operates entirely outside conscious control or deliberate analysis. You don't choose to see through social performances. You can't stop perceiving psychological complexity, even when you desperately want to engage at the simpler surface level that everyone else inhabits. Your conclusions about others' emotional states and hidden motivations arrive instantly and involuntarily. Complete insights delivered to conscious awareness without revealing how your unconscious mind generated those conclusions. Jung termed this automatic psychological perception, where your psyche continuously scans and processes information from social environments through channels operating beneath conscious awareness, only surfacing results when patterns reach sufficient clarity to warrant conscious attention. Modern neuroscience has validated Jung's observations through research demonstrating that human nervous systems constantly absorb emotional and behavioral information through unconscious channels. But Jung identified something more specific than general empathic sensitivity. He documented individuals whose unconscious perceptual apparatus had differentiated to extraordinary levels, creating what he metaphorically described as psychological sonar, detecting depths invisible to ordinary social awareness. Now, before we continue deeper into why this perception creates such profound danger, take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. Understanding these patterns Jung documented could fundamentally transform how you interpret experiences you've probably been told are entirely your fault, providing frameworks that validate what you've sensed your entire life but couldn't explain to people who don't share your perceptual reality. Here's what makes this perception genuinely dangerous rather than simply inconvenient. Human communities don't actually organize around honesty and direct communication. Despite cultural narratives suggesting otherwise, they structurally depend on collective denial to maintain group cohesion. Every family system operates through unspoken protocols, determining which topics remain safe for open discussion and which subjects must be avoided to preserve domestic stability. Every workplace establishes invisible guidelines about what observations can be voiced without jeopardizing professional relationships. Every friendship functions within implicit boundaries, defining how much psychological honesty the connection can tolerate before bonds fracture. Jung recognized these weren't conscious conspiracies, but emergent properties of group psychology. Unconscious agreements arising naturally when humans organize into collective structures. These agreements serve genuine adaptive functions, allowing communities to maintain unity by avoiding confrontation with psychological realities that might shatter the equilibrium holding groups together. You violate these unconscious social contracts simply by existing authentically, not through any deliberately provocative behavior. Your consciousness radiates a quality that others detect unconsciously as threatening to the psychological architecture maintaining group stability. Jung documented what he called the mirror effect to explain the specific mechanism generating hostility toward clear-seeing individuals. Your awareness functions as a reflective surface, showing people aspects of themselves they actively work to keep hidden from conscious recognition. The colleague suppressing rage beneath professional politeness sees their anger reflected in your awareness, and unconsciously interprets this reflection as you generating or projecting hostility onto them. The friend performing confidence to mask profound insecurity unconsciously feels their facade penetrated by your presence, and experiences this exposure as personal attack rather than simple observation. This isn't conscious psychological defense, but automatic protective mechanism operating at unconscious levels to shield the ego from unwanted self-knowledge. The Unconscious psyche confronts a fundamental choice when faced with its own denied contents reflected through your clear perception. It can accept the reflection and begin integrating previously disowned aspects of self, a psychologically demanding process requiring courage and honest self-examination. Or it can reject the reflection by attacking the mirror, projecting responsibility for uncomfortable feelings onto you rather than acknowledging their true internal origin. Jung's clinical records demonstrated that most people unconsciously select the second option with striking consistency. They blame you for manufacturing negativity, rather than examining what your perception reveals about their own psychological blind spots. This explains the pattern you've probably experienced repeatedly throughout your life. You consistently find yourself cast as the problem in every group you enter, accused of creating drama when mentioning obvious difficulties, labeled negative for acknowledging visible distress, characterized as judgmental for observing behaviors everyone can see but collectively agrees to ignore. Jung termed this the scapegoat mechanism, where you become an unconscious container for all the psychological contents that groups cannot consciously acknowledge about their own shadow dimensions. The community projects onto you responsibility for uncomfortable feelings that actually originate from the group's own denied material, effectively transforming you into someone who gets blamed for revealing problems rather than creating them. You're not imagining this persecution. You're accurately perceiving genuine social dynamics operating through unconscious mechanisms that target anyone whose awareness threatens collective denial systems. The community's unconscious mind identifies you as a threat, not to physical safety, but to psychological comfort, to the carefully maintained structures of strategic ignorance that allow groups to function without confronting difficult truths about their own nature and behavioral patterns. The psychological consequences extend far beyond social rejection into territory Jung considered genuinely dangerous to your mental health and identity integrity. He identified 3 progressively severe outcomes that hyperperceptive individuals experience when their abilities remain unintegrated with conscious awareness and protective practices. First comes what you've probably already felt: perceptual exhaustion that differs qualitatively from ordinary social fatigue. Even brief social encounters leave you drained for extended periods afterward. Not because the interactions involved conflict, but because maintaining dual awareness while suppressing half of what you perceive demands extraordinary psychological energy that accumulated exposure gradually depletes beyond natural recovery capacity. You're continuously operating in 2 incompatible realities simultaneously: the surface reality everyone else accepts as complete, and the deeper psychological reality that only you perceive. This isn't weakness or oversensitivity, it's the inevitable cost of processing information streams that others don't register. Second comes what Jung called consciousness exile, isolation that penetrates deeper than physical solitude into the fundamental experience of awareness itself. You feel like you inhabit an entirely different reality from everyone surrounding you, not merely holding different perspectives, but perceiving a fundamentally different world that others can't access and therefore can't validate as real. Jung wrote extensively about this particular suffering because he recognized it as distinct from ordinary loneliness. It's the isolation of perception itself, awareness trapped in frequencies that find no resonance in surrounding consciousness. Many people with this perception describe feeling like observers of human behavior from outside the species, able to analyze and understand social patterns intellectually, but unable to participate authentically because their perceptual reality remains incompatible with the collective reality others inhabit and assume represents complete accurate truth. You're not too sensitive or too negative. You're perceiving actual psychological dimensions that social agreements demand remain invisible. Third and most dangerous comes what Jung termed identity erosion, the progressive dissolution of contact with your own authentic psychological center through continuous absorption of external contents. You absorb unconscious material from surrounding environments so constantly and completely that you gradually lose capacity to distinguish your own genuine emotions from psychological contents you've unconsciously internalized from others. External material colonizes your inner world. Other people's denied feelings, suppressed conflicts, and unacknowledged needs flooding your psychological space until you no longer know which thoughts and feelings actually belong to your authentic self versus which represent absorbed debris from surrounding psychological fields. Jung used the term boundary dissolution to describe this state where your individual psychological integrity collapses and you become merged with collective contents, your separate selfhood dissolving into an undifferentiated ocean of external material. He considered this the ultimate danger because it represents not merely suffering, but genuine threat of psychological annihilation, complete loss of individual identity into collective possession. Yet Jung simultaneously recognized that this dangerous capacity, when consciously integrated rather than unconsciously endured, could transform from isolating burden into what he termed evolutionary function. The difference between destruction and transformation depends entirely on whether you learn specific integration practices Jung developed for maintaining individual identity while engaging consciously with unconscious material. He spent years refining therapeutic approaches designed specifically for hyperperceptive individuals, methods that preserve the gift while protecting from its inherent dangers. The foundational practice involves what Jung called authentic discrimination, systematic cultivation of ability to distinguish genuine inner experience from absorbed external contents. You need to develop capacity to recognize when you're processing psychological material that doesn't actually originate from your own psyche, learning to differentiate between emotions arising organically from your authentic self and feelings unconsciously internalized from surrounding environments that infiltrated your psychological space without conscious awareness or permission. This isn't intellectual exercise but embodied practice requiring daily solitude where absorbed material can settle like sediment in disturbed water, revealing your own authentic voice beneath accumulated psychological debris from external sources. Jung developed what he termed the individuation protocol specifically to address these dangers, recognizing that without systematic psychological practices, hyperperceptive individuals would remain trapped between two equally destructive outcomes: complete social withdrawal or total identity dissolution. The first practice Jung prescribed involved what he called conscious discrimination training, a daily discipline requiring extended periods of complete solitude where individuals could allow all absorbed psychological material to gradually settle and separate from their authentic inner voice. Jung instructed his patients to sit in silence for at least 1 hour daily, not meditating or thinking deliberately, but simply allowing their consciousness to sort itself naturally like sediment settling in disturbed water. During these periods, individuals learn to recognize a crucial distinction between psychological contents that arose organically from within their own psyche and materials that had been unconsciously absorbed from their environment throughout the day. Jung observed that authentic inner experience possessed a qualitatively different signature from internalized external content, describing it as having what he called organic coherence, arising naturally from the individual's genuine nature rather than feeling borrowed or foreign. His patients reported that with consistent practice, they developed increasingly refined ability to detect when they were processing someone else's denied anger versus experiencing their own genuine frustration, when they were carrying absorbed anxiety versus feeling authentically concerned. This discrimination practice served as the foundation for all subsequent integration work, because without clearly distinguishing between self and absorbed other, every therapeutic intervention would remain compromised by confusion about psychological ownership. Jung emphasized that this wasn't merely intellectual understanding but embodied awareness, a felt sense in the body that differentiated between psychological contents that belonged to one's authentic self and materials that had infiltrated from external sources. He instructed patients to notice physical sensations accompanying different types of psychological content, observing that absorbed material often felt heavy, foreign, or located in specific body regions where it didn't naturally belong. Authentic emotions arising from one's genuine inner life typically moved through the body with fluid coherence, while absorbed contents felt stuck, dense, or oddly disconnected from one's actual life circumstances. Jung documented that patients described absorbed material as feeling like wearing someone else's clothing, technically functional but fundamentally uncomfortable, never quite fitting their actual psychological shape. They reported that their own genuine emotions, even painful ones, possessed a quality of rightness, an internal resonance that absorbed contents could never replicate regardless of their intensity. The second crucial practice Jung developed addressed what he recognized as a fundamental paradox. Individuals who saw others' shadows with devastating clarity typically did so because they had never consciously integrated their own shadow. Contents Jung discovered through clinical observation that the psychological mechanism enabling hyperperception of others' denied qualities actually depended on maintaining those same qualities in one's own unconscious shadow. The more vigorously someone denied their own capacity for deception, the more acutely disturbed they became when perceiving dishonesty in others. The more completely someone repressed their own selfish impulses, the more viscerally they reacted to witnessing selfishness around them. Jung termed this phenomenon unconscious complementarity, where unintegrated personal shadow created hypersensitivity to identical contents in the collective field. Therefore, shadow integration became essential not for moral improvement, but for perceptual stabilization, allowing individuals to observe human darkness without reactive disturbance precisely because they had acknowledged that same darkness within themselves. Jung instructed patients through what he called shadow inventory work, systematically examining every quality they found disturbing in others, and asking whether they possessed that same capacity in different forms or contexts. This didn't mean confessing to being terrible people. It meant acknowledging complete humanity, recognizing that every quality observed in any human exists potentially in all humans, including oneself. The individual who integrated their shadow could then perceive others' shadow contents with what Jung called conscious compassion rather than unconscious judgment, seeing clearly without the reactive charge that made perception so socially dangerous. Jung documented that as patients completed substantial shadow integration, their social relationships improved dramatically, not because they perceived less, but because they perceived from integrated wholeness rather than unconscious fragmentation. He noted that integrated individuals could witness someone's denial, manipulation, or self-deception without experiencing the overwhelming emotional reactivity that previously made such observations unbearable. Their perception remained acute but no longer carried the painful charge of unconscious projection, transforming from wound into wisdom. Jung observed that shadow integration paradoxically increased perceptual accuracy while decreasing perceptual disturbance, allowing individuals to see human complexity with greater clarity precisely because they no longer needed to defend against recognizing similar complexity within themselves. The integrated observer could acknowledge that the colleague displaying arrogance might also carry hidden insecurity, that the friend acting selfishly might simultaneously harbor genuine care, that human beings contain multiplicities rather than singular essences. This complexity awareness prevented the binary thinking that plagued unintegrated perception, where people appeared either entirely good or completely corrupt, creating the exhausting cognitive dissonance of witnessing contradictions the observer couldn't reconcile. The third phase Jung developed involved what he termed boundary architecture, specific psychological techniques for maintaining individual identity while temporarily holding others' unconscious contents. Jung recognized that hyper-perceptive individuals needed to develop what he called conscious containers, psychological structures that could hold external material without becoming merged with it. He taught patients to visualize themselves as vessels with walls, capable of containing water poured into them while maintaining clear distinction between vessel and content. When absorbing someone's emotional distress during conversation, the integrated individual consciously recognized this distress as content within their awareness rather than their awareness itself, temporary guest rather than permanent resident. Jung emphasized practicing what he called conscious release rituals after every intense social interaction, deliberate acts that symbolically returned absorbed material to its rightful owners. These might involve physical gestures like washing hands while consciously intending to release what doesn't belong to oneself, or verbal statements spoken aloud in private declaring that specific, emotional contents are being consciously returned to their source. The crucial element wasn't the specific ritual form, but the psychological intention behind it, consciously distinguishing between helpful temporary holding and destructive permanent absorption. Jung observed that patients who maintained these practices reported dramatic reductions in the exhaustion and overwhelm that previously characterized their social experience. He documented cases where individuals who had previously required days of isolation to recover from single social events could engage fully in community life while maintaining their psychological integrity through consistent boundary practices. The transformation wasn't that they absorbed less material, but that they had learned conscious relationship with what they absorbed, holding it temporarily without becoming identified with it permanently. Jung noted that successful boundary maintenance created what he called permeable integrity, the capacity to remain open to others' psychological realities while maintaining uncompromised connection to one's own authentic center. This represented a middle path between two failed strategies: rigid defensive closure that prevented connection entirely, or complete boundary dissolution that sacrificed individual identity for merger with collective contents. Beyond individual integration practices, Jung investigated historical figures to understand successful versus failed integration at the highest levels of development. He studied the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche extensively, recognizing in Nietzsche's work evidence of extraordinary perceptual clarity, combined with catastrophic integration failure. Nietzsche possessed what Jung called prophetic consciousness, the ability to see through the psychological foundations of entire civilizations, detecting the unconscious agreements holding together religious systems, moral frameworks, and social structures. But Jung observed that Nietzsche wielded his perception as a weapon for demolishing illusions, rather than as a tool for constructive transformation, ultimately becoming consumed by the very forces he attempted to expose. Nietzsche's increasing isolation, his progressively aggressive tone, and his eventual psychological collapse represented for Jung the inevitable outcome of unintegrated superior perception, consciousness that destroyed rather than transformed because it never learned to serve healing. Jung noted that Nietzsche's writings grew increasingly hostile toward humanity itself, reflecting what happens when hyperperception remains untempered by shadow integration and conscious humility. Philosopher's final years demonstrated the tragic endpoint of perception, divorced from compassion, awareness that recognized truth but had lost capacity for serving life. In contrast, Jung studied medieval mystic Meister Eckhart as an exemplar of successfully integrated hyperperception applied to spiritual and psychological realities. Eckhart possessed what Jung termed mystical intuition, direct perception of psychological and spiritual truths that remained completely inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart translated his overwhelming perceptions into teachings that invited others toward expanded awareness, rather than attacking them for their current limitations. Jung noted that Eckhart's approach embodied what he called conscious humility, recognizing superior perception as a gift demanding wise stewardship rather than a weapon validating superiority. Eckhart spoke from integrated wholeness, acknowledging his own psychological complexity, while offering insights that nourished rather than overwhelmed his audiences. His sermons demonstrated the possibility of perceiving profound truths while maintaining compassionate connection with those still navigating toward such awareness. Jung observed that Eckhart's success stemmed from his recognition that perception served love rather than judgment, that seeing clearly meant witnessing the divine potential within human limitation, rather than condemning the limitation itself. Most significantly, Jung documented his own integration journey through what he termed his confrontation with the unconscious, a 6-year period from 1913 to 1919, where his own hyperperception nearly destroyed him. During this period, Jung experienced what he later recognized as a controlled descent into what could easily have become psychosis, overwhelmed by unconscious contents from both his personal psyche and the collective unconscious field. He recorded his experiences in what became known as the Red Book, documenting visions, dialogues with archetypal figures, and psychological insights that arrived with such intensity they threatened his sanity. Jung's survival depended entirely on his ability to apply to himself the same integration practices he was developing for his patients, maintaining just enough conscious awareness to understand what was happening rather than being consumed by it. His breakthrough arrived when he recognized these overwhelming perceptions not as pathological breakdown but as evolutionary breakthrough, consciousness attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations through him as individual vessel. This realization transformed Jung's entire therapeutic approach, shifting from viewing hyperperception as disorder requiring treatment to recognizing it as advanced consciousness requiring integration. Jung emphasized throughout his later work that individuals with superior perception faced a critical choice that would determine whether their gift became curse or calling. They could attempt isolation, withdrawing from social engagement to protect themselves from overwhelm, which Jung recognized as slow psychological death disguised as self-protection. They could pursue unconscious helping, defining themselves entirely through serving others' needs, while losing contact with their own authentic development, sacrificing personality to function. They could fall into what Jung termed the inflation trap, identifying with their superior function and believing themselves bearers of absolute truth, cutting themselves off from genuine human connection through spiritual superiority. Or they could commit to conscious individuation, the demanding but ultimately liberating path of integrating their perception through systematic psychological work. Jung taught that successful individuation transformed hyperperception from isolating burden into what he called cultural medicine, consciousness that served collective evolution. Naturally, without forcing or preaching, the individuated person no longer experienced their perception as overwhelming affliction but as integrated capacity. They could engage consciously and disengage deliberately. They maintained meaningful relationships because they had learned to modulate their awareness appropriately for different contexts and connections. They contributed to collective consciousness evolution simply by embodying more conscious ways of being, serving as what Jung termed bridges between unconscious and conscious, making visible what collective awareness was approaching readiness to integrate. Jung believed these individuals served a vital evolutionary function throughout human history, appearing as consciousness pioneers whose personal development preceded collective readiness, sensing psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. He observed that what manifested first as individual psychological insight eventually emerged in collective culture as broader transformation, the sensitive individual functioning as early warning system and experimental laboratory for consciousness developments that would later benefit humanity as a whole. Your hyperperception isn't evidence of psychological malfunction. It's an evolutionary feature of advanced consciousness development. And the integration practices Jung developed offer the path from isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming burden to transformative gift that serves both your authentic flourishing and the collective evolution that your awareness has always been preparing you to serve.